that, I'll turn it over to Guy. Thanks.
Thank you, Sunil. Yeah, as Sunil stated, this is a bit of building on what Gadi presented last year, which was a way to think of defense. How do you think about defense if you can't think about the offense, the attacking side? A couple of words about myself. I got into that field in a very curious and bizarre way, actually, through a fiction novel, one which was published actually 10 years ago and got some traction both in the US at MIT and then also in Israel with people who deals with cyber defense. And from that on, I started to write a couple of papers for INSS in Israel, the Institute for National Security Studies, and now I'm developing some research with PwC in France. But the key thing, the nagging thing is how do you think about that topic, and especially when you think about defense. And I was quite pleased last year when Gadi started that conversation and stated we need something about defense. And that got me into actually what was some of the basis of my research, which has nothing to do with cybersecurity per se, but going back to models which would come to, say, 40 years ago during the Cold War, game theoretic models around offense and defense. And that goes directly into some writings, some of those from Robert Jervis, again, 40 years ago, thinking about offense-defense theory and how the balance of offense and defense can actually change the overall security environment. And that was the start of my thinking, and made a couple of TEDx talks around that. Now, the interesting thing is, what does it mean in terms of defensive weapons and offensive weaponries? When you go back to Robert Jervis, the main idea is that you're defending versus you're attacking only when your defensive weapons are creating a cost whenever the attacker attacks. That is, you're kind of in a rest position, and you only incur a cost, but when the attacker attacks you. And on top of that, if we frame a bit what Jervis is trying to say, you actually attack his attacking means. That's a way to think about what is defense. In a way, defense is reactive. It's only on when there's an attacker. It's somehow proportional because it only attacks, it only defends or reacts in as much as you're being attacked. And somehow it's limited to the attacking means that are being attacked. There are a couple of characteristics, again, going back to Jervis 40 years ago, about how those defensive weapons can work out. One key thing is that you'd have say, time and energy and an information asymmetry that would go in favor of a defender. The one thing is the time advantage is that evidently you're going to delay the attacker. Once you're attacking, we delay the attacker, then you have a bit of an information asymmetry in your favor as a defender that you start building up. And evidently, you have also, when you think in terms of the old castle and you're standing as defending the old castle, and you see the attacker coming in, you have also a bit of an energy advantage because you see the guys coming up and you're in top positions, you have more kinetic energy. You see, and again, you see their lines of communication. They don't know your own lines of communication within your fortified castle. And all those advantages should work out to you. And that's actually why in, say, traditional military doctrine, you always come to think that the defenders, the attackers, to try to overcome the defender position needs to have a 2 or 3 to 1 advantage in terms of number of people versus the defender. And then the big question is why we don't see that in the so-called cyberspace world, in the informational domain, whenever we have a battle in the information domain. Just one thing, again, and I'll mention that at the end of the talk. There are diplomatic consequences on that. There are international instability or stability around that, and that was actually the point made by Jervis back 40 years ago. If you live in a world where the military technology actually gives the advantage to the defense, then you may live in an actual very stable world. And we have examples of that in history. Back between 1650 and 1750, 1756, actually the 7 Years' War, you had a period of stability in Europe, which coincides with the development of Vauban fortification, which were a new way to actually build your fortifications. So there was a correlation here between a new military technology that gave the advantage to the defense and international stability. If you move forward into, say, the 1930s, then you have the advance of new type of weaponry that actually gives the advantage to the attackers. I mean, we're talking here about airplanes, we're talking here about the development of tanks, and all that is going to be summed up into the Blitzkrieg doctrine. And in some ways, what happened in Europe by the end of the 1930s is also the product of the development of all these military technologies encompassed within that Blitzkrieg doctrine. And that also gives us a kind of additional data point in favor of Jarvis' doctrine. And when you move forward, and this was the kind of game theoretic model set up by Jarvis, if you live in an environment where actually you have a perceived advantage to the offense, military technology gives a perceived advantage to the offense, and another point, there is no clear distinctions between your military capabilities that you're building, either they are for the offense or the defense. That is, I mean, you're sitting and on your frontier, and on the other side you see your enemy and it's starting to building military capabilities, and he's saying, it's only for defensive purpose, but actually you can't see very much, you can't understand that, you can distinguish that. That is going, both those elements, the perceived advantage to events of the dominant military technology and the non-distinguishable posture, that is going to give a lot of anxiety. And to Jarvis, this is the doubly dangerous environment. And basically, that may have been the environment at the start of World War I. Now, I emphasize the point of perceived advantage to the offense, because what all the antagonists during World War I are going to do is they are going to go into battle thinking that there will be a clear winner very quickly because of all those elements of giving an advantage to the offense, actually based on previous battles back in 1866 and what Bismarck did 50 years before that. But then they are going to realize that no, that was a mistake because of development of fortified of trenches and of machine guns. Actually, the technology environment was for the defense, and that was the mistake that became World War I. And the question is, are we here today with cyber weaponry? Because the perception is that it gives the advantage to the offense, that there's an asymmetry in favor of the attacking side versus the defensive side. I'm not sure it's completely true, but that's one of the main perceptions today. And the other issue is that you set up your military capabilities in terms of cyber weaponry, that is people and machines and software. From afar, it's very hard to know if it's only for the offense or the defense. So that's basically where you find yourself in this position somehow. And that evidently has lots of diplomatic consequences, especially today, when you add a layer of geopolitical risk today. Now, so this was a short presentation I made in a TEDx talk in Paris 7 years ago. And at that time, I must say that I was actually quite worried in terms of the development of cyber weaponry and what it would mean in terms of internal instability. And then something happened around the development of new type of cyber weaponry, and that's what I want to talk about now. And one thing to think about is go back to the OODA loop and see how we can apply it. The information domain works differently from, say, the traditional kinetic domain in the sense that your most strategic point is not your top position, your mountain, your hill, your top hill, but perhaps where you have your most pertinent information. And to that respect, there are lots of parallels between the intelligence world. You go to Langley, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And basically, people in intelligence work in the Western world, the main task is actually to get the most pertinent information to deciders. And you win because you have the best information. And so you can think of the information domain as a new domain, military domain, where the top position may be getting the first to the truth, or what may be the truth. And thus, the competitive advantage here may be, how do I get faster to the truth than my opponent? And you can say either how you adapt yourself quicker to get to the truth, how you learn quicker to get to the truth than your opponent. But that may be the heart of the game, the core of the game. So thinking back at the OODA loop, I guess everyone knows about it here, I would assume. And we'll go back into detail. But the way most people think is in defense mode, always about ourselves, the defender. And what's interesting is to see the interaction with the attacking side, because the attacking side also has a OODA loop. And so these are broad generalization based on something I presented in France 3 years ago. Things have changed a little bit. But you can make the point that the core thing today is still about detecting the enemy, detecting what the attacker is trying to do. So that is being in the best position for the defender to observe what's going on. And that relates evidently to the act part of the OODA loop of the attacker. But then, as long as we don't do, we don't do anything against the observing part of the attacker, then the attacker can continue to observe and learn, make inferences, and then adapt itself. And thus, there may be an explanation why we go into this ongoing game where we think that more money is being invested, more efforts are being made, but at the end of the day, we don't seem to really catch up against the bad guys. Now, if you actually attack the observed part of the attacker's OODA loop, then maybe you may be able all of a sudden to change the game and to stop the attackers to learn about yourself. And that is the key thing. And again, to use some of the points made by Jervis 40 years ago, and some others actually, which are very classical in intelligence work, some elements may be to hide what you're doing so that the attackers doesn't have the right picture about what's going on, and then to deceive, so that is a way to go much further into showing a wrong picture to the attacker so that he thinks he's learning something that's not the right thing he's learning, and then even to do some sort of counter-deception, or we could call that intoxication of the enemy. And there are plenty of examples in history. In World War II, which is a great set of examples that you can always reuse as metaphors. But you can think about the shaft being used against the German enemies and the effects on the German radars, all the shafts which were used by British Lancaster bombers, the work of R.V. Jones back 70 years ago. Again, a way to confuse the German radar enemies. But also one thing, and this goes really into what is being developed by people like Gadi with Symmetria and other companies like Cybertrap in Europe, and a new set of, say, defensive cyber weapons which are now popping up. And definitely, to my sense, there is, again, a big element here to learn more about the enemy, because as you build those deceptive defense, you're actually creating a sort of virtual strategic depth into which you can take the time to learn about what the enemy is doing versus the enemy learning on you. Other things, so other elements to think of, which also come from the past. It's very important, if you look back at World War II, not to show to the enemy that you know about him. Again, great examples about convoys and the way the Brits would use their submarines to attack German convoys in the Mediterranean, for example, during World War II, where each time they would identify, because they had break the code via Bletchley Park, each time they would identify some German convoys, they would really make the point to have planes over them and to have some sort of contact, so that actually the Germans think that there are plenty of submarines following, British submarines following the British planes. And so at the end of the day, the Germans, the Brits managed to receive that type of hiding deception, because the Germans thought that there were about 400 submarines in the Mediterranean, 400 British submarines, though actually there were only 25. Same thing applied actually for the Atlantic convoys, very critical element of World War II, and was part of the movie, I forgot the Imitation Game, that there were some clear decision made that you should not be able to protect all the convoys. You should accept that some of the convoys would actually be destroyed, so that you don't reveal that you know. And that may be a couple of ideas for the defensive side. And then if you move forward and still keeping the tradition of British intelligence and imagination around British intelligence, is evidently all the elements of intoxication that you can do. That is, the way you're going to make attribution, and even beyond attribution, the way you are going to actually create harm to the enemy. So here you already have in the industry people who are going to make poison documents. So that documents that are being taken and then that are being opened somewhere else, you can actually identify where they were opened. And that's the first way, an element to do attribution. But there are examples that can push the envelope much further. For example, I know of one French example where actually there was this company that's selling commercial leads, and they had understood the path of the attack, because they could see that some of the leads all of a sudden were being put in some other areas, were stolen. And so what they decided to do is that they created, once they understood really the path and how the attackers would act, they created a simile server where they put wrong leads. And so the attacker continued to attack, but now they would attack the wrong server. They would take out the wrong leads. They would put the wrong leads then on the actual client. And there, the defending company managed two things. A, they could properly identify who was actually the client who picked up initially the leads, because that was another website company. And on top of that, because all the leads were fake, it created a commercial cost to the bad competitor. And the attack just stopped. Well, that's one way you can do intoxication. If you think a bit beyond the envelope, and you push a bit the thinking, still along those lines, well, maybe in other instances of all that, you could have different layers of simulation and multiply the different layers of simulation. As you say, for example, as you see, for example, in drug therapies, for example, with AIDS, with multi-therapies. And if you have software providers that are able to do those things nicely, then you can combine all that. I'll move forward. One of the big elements also, if you move beyond the OODA lab in the ops, orient and decide, which is really the part where you're going to make the thinking around what you're going to do before the acting. Then in some ways today the big game is to try to bring as much information internally, but also hopefully externally. It's a big issue, but the idea is that if you have the cybercrime world, not talking about nation-state things, but the because it's another game, but the cybercrime world versus the private world, you may think that there is more trust, hopefully, more money for sure, and perhaps more collaboration to be built in the so-called white world versus the black cybercrime world, or hopefully so. And that one idea to think about moving forward into the OODA lab. And that will go into this ecosystem, which is somehow building up between nation states that are cooperating with all sorts of new actors here. And one last idea is that, so you manage to break, hopefully, the observed part of the attacker. You try to overpower the orient decide part of the attacker by exchanging more information, cooperating more. And then perhaps you can even strip away some of the people from the cybercrime world. And the way you do that is that you just co-opt people. And then that's how we managed to end the Cold War. It was not by attacking Soviet Union, but actually first with Helsinki in 1975. Good. Yeah, well, he needs to.
So, switch of the choices between defect, cooperate, et cetera. Doesn't this essentially require that you have an opponent that is sitting at the table, a rational, even a semi-rational, not even fully rational? Any model of the prisoner's dilemma requires that your opponent have some reason to sit down with you to start this conversation, or have there be some consequences. I'm failing to map this to most of our instances of information attacks, or unless you're specifically and purely focusing on, if you are, I may have missed it, on nation-state level interactions. There's no other set of actors who are ever going to have a situation like that where they sit down together. No opponent is ever going to sit down with anyone here acting as a defender, metaphorically or otherwise, and have this sort of option. I'm failing to follow.
We're not talking about sitting down, right? And no one's sitting down with no one. And this is just a metaphor. Okay, so the idea is that there's a calculation, supposedly from rational black hat guys, that they need to be rational in the sense that they need to think about where they're going to be making more money, basically. And the idea that if you can co-opt them through your bug bounty, which we're starting to see the spread of, and you're able to transform the economic calculation from them, because in a way what they're doing is they're testing software that hasn't been tested previously, so there's a bit of give and take here. Then maybe, I'm not talking about all of the guys, but perhaps a critical mass of those guys, or a subset of that critical mass, will start to switch sides. But that means to give more money on the table. Okay, so that's one third pillar. The key thing is that if you combine all of that, especially the first one, maybe you start having a bit of a ground game against the enemy, because first, again, you go against the attack, which was the detect part of the defender, but then you're going to go against the observe of the attacker, you're going to go against the orient and decide of the attacker because you are going to overpower him, and then maybe a couple of guys you're going to take out because they're going to work for the white guys versus the black guys. And that could be sort of a ground game. The interesting thing here, now going back into more the diplomatic environment that can be set, is that for the first time, at least with those deceptive defense technologies, we may have weaponry which are clearly set to give the advantage to the defense. I'm still not sure, actually I've put there, I'm still not sure that from afar you can have, it can be distinguished that either that capabilities is really from the offense or the defense, you need to believe the other guys and you cannot believe the other guys. But at least there's a possibility that if deceptive defense technologies are being spread, we may move further into that side. And that will also have an impact on the private world, because in a way the private world also functions with, say, the nation-state world. And if there's more cooperation between nation-states because there's an advantage to the defense, and then there'll be more trust, elements of trust that can be built between nation-states, always starting, from the guys that have already the habit of cooperating together. Let's not make big ideas, but starting with, and then slowly expanding step by step, because trust is not something that you can build by just signing a paper. It's something that you build by doing things. But slowly, step by step, you can expand. But then those deceptive technologies may create an environment where more cooperation may be possible. And that will also help, evidently, again, the defense side, because if there's more cooperation between nation states, more information being exchanged, then there'll be more information being distributed to all the private sector actors of the defending side. And we'll get into some sort of virtuous circle, hopefully. That's an idea, anyway. And at any rate, a framework of thinking about those elements. Thinking forwards, there was the question about the type of framework. When I came to the conference last year, and I still have this thinking this year, I'm always thinking if we want to put some elements of science into the thinking, we need to put some elements of reason. And reason comes from ratio, in Latin measure, as a way to compare things. And I'm always thinking how I can measure things. And for example, how I could indeed measure that I'm learning more about the opponent than the opponent can learn more about myself. Because if that's the case, then maybe I've won the competition. That is an open-ended question at this stage. That's it. So if there are any questions?
So not so much a question as an observation. I mean, so your research question is, can a more stable defense-dominated world be achieved? Maybe, but I think that a defense-dominated posture really reinforces the status quo so much more than an attack-focused perspective kind of stimuluses or makes a response out of the defense, right? You know, the idea of mutually assured destruction was that we will not go on the offense because we know that the consequences are so severe that it disincentivizes action. So it wasn't so much the defense that stimulated action so much as status quo to preserve the to mitigate the consequence. So I think you always get more significant stimulus out of offense than defense.
It's a great point, actually. And when you come to think about resilience, one reason why some organizations or nations are resilient is that they are constantly attacked. So they are always, on the lookout. So that means that, the key thing is to get the upper edge, but not to destroy the attackers, perhaps precisely for that point. That's a possibility. Okay, so
I'm going to apologize first for coming in late, but piggybacking on this, in the OODA loop, however, it's the observational aspect that is really critical. So part of this is how do you have the mini attacks, the constant training and probe your probe actual adversary, not necessarily what we a quote unquote imitation of an adversary, and how do you constantly get that so your muscle memory. Because in a response mode, defensive mode, it's how quickly can you realize that, how quickly can you orient? So that observe-orient part, instead of the DA, needs to be constantly cycled to basically enhance the response.
So it goes back a bit to the same question to some respect, is how you actually test that the observe. But we're still here in the detect mode, right? But how do we still test, that we observe correctly? Which is one thing which is actually not exactly what I was addressing somehow. Still, evidently it's an important question.
I think it's actually kind of ancillary because earlier we set the scenario that achieving knowledge was one of the strategic intents of intelligence, right? Yeah. But it's not necessarily who gets at the intelligence first. It's how quickly and how effectively you can orient in order to act. right? Defend or attack. If adversary Y gets to the knowledge first but takes analysis paralysis or has an ineffective strategy that they can't implement, but a defender B does quicker and more effectively, then you still are victorious in that regard. So I think it's very much orient and then decide and act. The second half of the OODA loop there.
And then, it goes back to try to overpower the orient decide bit. More rapid response and cooperation also, which is something which is absolutely fundamental, because here we're talking about information, we're talking about networks, everything works in network, and there's the elements of cooperation are very important, and that's why also the element of diplomatic environments still are very important.
Well, one of the problems, though, is that what Janos brought up yesterday, for instance, about opinion engineering. That phrase scares the hell out of me, by the way. Opinion engineering. How do we take into account, based on these kinds of models and these kinds of thought processes, that the majority of what we're talking about, or at least not the majority, some of what we're talking about is this issue of psychology being used in this particular fight. So how do you, in an information war, get around this issue of information influence, opinion engineering, however you want to term it, fake news, if you want to call it that says, hey, we can't use an OODA loop when we're talking about opinion engineering and fake news and how you determine the reality of fact. That's something that I think we have to also at least consider when we talk about something like this, is what are we going to do to discern what is reality and what is not? That's going to be a tough equation to think about in all this too.
I like your very last point, how we discern between reality and simulation, because what that means will be the widespread use of simulation to build that defense. But there's always the risk that at some point we get confused also, even the defensive side. And perhaps one of the attackers, who knows about future strategies, but some of the attackers will force us to be confused. And so all that is open. Now, just for the first point.
Yeah. So to go to your point, basically what you're looking at is using structured methods to develop critical thinking in the people who are observing and orienting so that they can make correct decisions. The problem with this is, this has been studied amongst intel analysts at multiple organizations, analysts studying known propaganda from a nation state, despite the fact that they know that it is propaganda, will begin to believe it. Somewhere between 6 months and a year, they will start to diverge, and just because that's what they're exposed to consistently. So you actually have to introduce the counterpoints at the same time. If you don't, you're going to get a skewed view. Yeah, and people will start to believe it, even though they know it's a lie intellectually. I keep pumping these books, and I don't get any kickbacks or anything. But structured analytic techniques by Huer and Fearson, like that is the start. We need to get the people who are making decisions using repeatable processes to develop critical thinking skills. And then they can do this. Until you have that, we've already lost.
All right. That was a very interesting discussion. Guy, thanks very much for the turbo talk.
Sure.
So at this point, we're going to take a break. But before I release you guys, I did put a poll up to figure out which framework discussions you want to be a part of. Basically, there's really only 3 at this point because no one's choosing the deception one. But anyway, if there is another framework that you guys want to think we should discuss, certainly let me know. But I think at this point in time, I'm looking at 3 framework discussions, 2 which may run in parallel based on the split of the people who are interested, and then I'll have Kelly actually facilitate the one that I think has the most votes so far, which is the forecasting and the hazard assessment one. So when we reconvene in about 15 minutes, thereabouts, we'll reconvene at 11, okay? And we'll talk about, we'll set parameters around the framework objectives that we have. Okay, great.